Have any of you ever been outed? Some instance, some moment where you preferred to keep your faith hidden, your relationship with Jesus to yourself? Maybe it was you simply were not looking for an opportunity to share your faith, to be a light. But then another Christian points you out. There's a certain pastor who I learned to sort of fear seeing in public because he took seemingly every opportunity God granted him to share Jesus in some way. One time I saw him in passing at URI, just by the front desk. I was going to swim some laps. He had just finished doing the same. And while I would have been more than happy with a handshake, a hug, trivial details about how many laps he did and how many more I would do, I could not get past that front desk before he got everyone's attention behind it until he had asked each one of them where they went to church. Until he had got me to tell them where my church was, that I was a pastor, and until he had told all of them how tremendous of a pastor I was. And here this whole time I'm just trying not to blush. And he urged them to check us out. Now, this might seem like an exceptional example. Indeed, it is. There have been relatively few times when someone has outed me like that in public, especially where a gifted evangelist has put me on the spot like that and done so without bothering anyone, but actually endearing them to consider the gospel. Peter's situation here was, of course, quite a bit different. Nobody inside the Jesus community was threatening to out Peter. It was those outside the Jesus community that were trying to make him show his true colors. And it's not because there were no other Jesus people present. There clearly from the text was. In verse 15, even though the person goes unnamed, verse 15 reveals that Peter was not alone in this somewhat intimate setting. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. So this other disciple, whoever it was Jesus' ticket in. So, Peter was not alone. We don't know who this person was. Historically, he's been identified with none other than the Apostle John, who is referred to elsewhere in this gospel as the beloved disciple. But whether or not this figure is John, it shows us that the comfort of having a comrade close by was insufficient to make Peter stand up in his moment of trial. At least at the first round of questioning, and then we see it the second and third. One writer said this about at least that initial at the door moment, which must, I'm sure, have caught Peter off guard. The very first question you're asked, do you follow Jesus? It's a little intense given what's about to transpire, given what Jesus has predicted. This writer said this, he may, speaking of Peter, he may have viewed this first instance of self-distancing from the master as a rite of admission to the courtyard. But once performed, it was easy to repeat with rising vehemence. We don't get as clear in this gospel that rising vehemence, but all the other gospels make it very clear. As Peter continues to reject the claim that he's a Christian, he gets more and more aggressive with it, even heaping a curse upon himself, taking an oath that he doesn't follow Christ. I don't even know the man. What this author said, don't we find this true everywhere in life? There might be a place we know we ought never to go, a line we know never to cross, and yet once that line is crossed, once it's crossed just once, it is rarely crossed only once. The scary thing about Peter's denials, like any of ours, is they become easier with practice, regardless of how shameful we might find them. It just becomes easier and easier. And while Peter's fearful self-preservation is understandable, it is no less wretched. More than that, if such a denial like that of Peter's was not entirely repented of, it wouldn't be just like a blight on his resume, it would be his undoing. When Jesus uses the language of denial throughout all the gospel accounts, it is on the most severe terms. Luke 9:23 considers it a basic tenet of following Christ. Jesus said to them all, "If anyone wants to become my follower, he must deny himself," using that same word deny, "take up his cross daily and follow me." That one must deny himself, pick up his cross, and follow me. But here Peter was dodging his cross and instead denying his Lord, and in the worst way, before others, which is explicitly what Jesus condemned most strongly. In Luke 12:8-9, Jesus said, "I tell you, whoever acknowledges me before men, the Son of Man will also acknowledge before God's angels." That's a very sweet promise. We should all take that one home today. Whoever acknowledges me before men, I also will acknowledge him before my Father in heaven. But there's a flip side. The one who denies me before men will be denied before God's angels. So this denial, it's a severe thing. I think there's a risk of, after we reading this every year in our Bible reading plans and hearing this around every Easter time frame, there's a risk of Peter's denials kind of losing its edge to it. But this is the most, outside of Judas's action, this is recorded as the most vile of practices done against Jesus. You could argue that what the high priest did and what Pilate did, that was much more vile. But they were on the outside. Peter was on the most inner circle. There are several other elements here that make Peter's denials uniquely brutal. There's a lot here, but I'll just point out a couple for you. For one, Peter's denial is made much more disheartening because, as we've already made reference to, he did so in the presence of another disciple. The text clearly says there was another disciple who gained Peter entry. He would not have been able to gain entry without him. And so it's in the presence of another disciple who we can presume Peter knows well and they know him well. It's in the presence of them that Peter makes his denials. With the level of detail provided in this particular gospel account, the type of fire referenced, it's referenced the charcoal fire. It's not just some generic fire. There's more detail about the people who are questioning him. The other gospels talk about the servant girl. But here, one of the people who questions Peter towards the end, John Scott, or whoever's writing this, seems to have very intimate knowledge of who it was. They recognize that the one who questioned Peter towards the end was a relative of Malchus, whose ear Peter had cut off. And so it's highly suggestive that all of this detail that's unique to the Gospel of John is coming from the eyewitness himself, who is in the same general vicinity as Peter. And what's more, this other believer who likely witnessed at least some of Peter's increasingly aggressive denials, the other disciple seems to have already outed himself one way or another. And one way that's revealed is in the form of the question. If you look at verse 17 and then you look at verse 25, the questions are almost identical, even though they're on the lips of different parties. In both places, they employ the same language when they ask, you also are not one of his disciples, are you? You don't say also unless you have something else, someone else in view, which was apparently the other disciple who was well known to the high priest. The text is strongly suggestive that small audience there, they knew at least that one that was known to the high priest, and maybe because of his relationship there, they wouldn't prod him the same way they prodded Peter. But he was apparently out in the open, but Peter was not. And so it's in the view of this other disciple who seems to be, according to the questions asked, out in the open. It's in the presence of that one that Peter doubles, even triples down on his denials. Here's one more thing that makes this whole scene more brutal. And it's the way John chose, led by the Holy Spirit, to write down this whole account. If you look in the broader context of the Gospel of John, and you look at just the language of denial, that word for deny, outside of its references that are connected with Peter's denial, there is only one other use of the word. So all of the uses of that word, denying Christ, are tied to Peter, except for one other time. And what is the context at one other time? That one other time is in John chapter 1, verse 20. The scene is the priestly aristocracy has sent people to aggressively question John the Baptist about who he was and why he was baptizing people. And his answer, ironically, sounded just like Peter's, except for one key thing. John the Baptist was not asked if he was a Christian. John the Baptist was asked if he was the Christ. And his answer is recorded employing the very language of denial, but his was a refusal to deny. John 1, verse 20, the language is clearly given to us in a way that's intended to be abundantly redundant, like that phrase just was. He confessed and did not deny, but confessed. Abundantly redundant. He confessed and did not deny, but confessed, I am not the Christ. But he didn't run from who he was. He said who he was. I'm making the way for the Christ. The next time the word deny is used in John's gospel is John 13, when Jesus warns Peter, you will deny me. And the final time John uses the word is at Peter's actual denial right here. And again, Peter's answer echoes John's almost exactly, but to a very different effect. John answered, I am not. And when they asked other questions, well, are you Elijah? And he said, I'm not. Are you this? I'm not. Before he said who he was. And so that whole time he's saying, ou eimi. Do you remember what Jesus has been saying throughout this gospel? Ego eimi. I am. I am. I am. John had said, ou eimi, because that's not who I am. And then he said his own ego eimi. This is who I am. But here, Peter says in verse 17 and then 25, both time, I'm not, I'm not, I'm not. But here he's not saying I'm not the Christ. He's saying I'm not even with the Christ. I don't know the guy. And all of this is set over against other examples in John's gospel. One of them we heard about earlier in John chapter 9. The man's not even named. And he didn't start off as a disciple. He was just a man who was blind from birth. John chapter 9. A man blind from birth who Jesus decided in his mercy to heal. That man himself, after simply being healed by Jesus, he was aggressively questioned. And his identity was even doubted. In John chapter 9, verse 9 to 10, after he's healed, and people are questioning about this guy, is that the blind guy? They start even denying his identity rather than accept the miracle. Some said, it is he. Others said, no, but he is like him. Verse 10, he kept saying to them, I am the man. He says, ego eimi, I am. He's not running from it. I am. I'm the guy. And that man eventually believed and followed Jesus, but not before he first got booted from the synagogue for simply acknowledging Jesus and that he had healed him. He wasn't acknowledging at that point that Jesus was the Christ. He didn't know what to say about him. I guess he's a prophet. He seems to be a good guy. But he didn't run from it. Even when it cost him incredible social shame, being kicked out of the synagogue, the most important place for a Jew. And so the contrast is severe. Here, one of his foremost and his fiercest disciples cannot even stand in a small crowd and say, apparently like the other disciple, when asked, by the grace of God, I am what I am. You know what? I am. I am a Christian. I'm with Jesus. But instead, and more aggressively, he said, ooh, me, I'm not. Peter's denials they're really brutal to behold when you slow down and think about it. And they're included in each of the gospel accounts. There are many details that are chosen in each of the gospels. None of them are saying everything. All of them are saying the same thing about Christ, but all of them are choosing to do different things. But all of them talk about Jesus' prediction of Peter's denials. All of them deal with Peter's actual denials. And all of them give a pretty good space for it. Let's just stop and ask ourselves why that might be for a second. We're kind of arguing from silence. But why would all the Gospels make sure to include this? I think foremost, there's a lot of places we could go with that thought. Maybe it's supposed to be a warning that, hey, if one of the foremost and fiercest disciples of Christ, someone who is literally ready to chop someone's head off within an hour before them, and missed, he caught the ear. I don't think he was just going for a little ear nick, right? It's probably a death blow that was dodged. If that disciple, when pressed, could deny Christ, we ought to pray, as Jesus urged Peter to do before his fall. Pray that you do not enter into temptation. Right? If Peter, the foremost, the fiercest disciple, could deny Christ, do you think it's possible? Is it within the realm of possibility that one of us could do that under similar duress? And so we would be urged, doubtless when John wrote this, not speaking of the other gospel accounts, but John's inclusion of this. And he probably puts more about Peter than anyone. It's the most extensive. It goes back and forth between Peter and Jesus. Doubtless part of his reason for doing that is his audience who is receiving this gospel is a people who have come under tremendous duress. They are being urged in every way to deny Christ. And so it would be tremendously useful pastorally for John the Apostle to share this and for them to receive this. First century Rome. And the heat is ratcheting up towards Christians. And there are purges coming. And they are being asked in different ways to compromise. This would be a tremendously beneficial text for them to meditate on, to consider. Peter fell. Peter, his name means rock. And Peter fell. We better be in prayer that we also do not fall, that we do not deny Christ. That would be tremendously useful for them. So that's, I think in large part why it's so emphasized in John's gospel. But there's another thing going on here because, again, it's in all the gospels, regardless of situation. And I think it's this. I think it's to make the contrast clear between what Jesus is like and what even some of the best of us are like. Peter is not the worst guy in the world. Peter is not Judas. The contrast is stark between how Jesus acted under pressure and how one of the best of us did. And so Peter's denials are brutal to behold, but Jesus' boldness is all the more breathtaking once we take our eyes off of Peter. It's in that contrast, his denials, that we see Jesus' boldness really come to the surface more clearly. Jesus, for his part, at least as recorded in John's gospel here, there seems to be at least a couple encounters here, and it might be confusing to some. Jesus comes before Annas, who's referenced as the high priest, but just a passage ago, we heard that Caiaphas, so from verse 13 in the same chapter, first they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest. But now it seems that he's coming before Annas, the high priest, and we're going, how many high priests are there? Well, it's a complicated question, actually. How long, quick Bible study question, how long was the high priest supposed to serve in his capacity as high priest? Okay, we got 1 year. Anybody else? 5, okay. Think Old Testament. 7, okay, we're getting closer. I'm telling you, we're getting closer. Think all the way back. Who is the first high priest under Israel, properly ordered? Who's the first high priest? Aaron. Was he there for 1 year? 5 year? 7 year? Till death. It is a lifelong duty. You go to the end. That was written in the law. The high priest shall be the high priest all the way to the end. Annas was high priest for 9 years. What's going on here? He's still living. He's talking to Jesus. It's not his ghost. Well, because of Rome's ominous power that was upon the Jews, they had so affected the structures of Jerusalem that they even had a hand over the priesthood. So they had power to depose. So I believe it was the governor prior to Pilate who deposed Annas and then set up Caiaphas. And Caiaphas seemed to be really crafty politically because relative to the others, you guys weren't wrong to say 1, 5, and 7, because at this time, that's like an expected, pastorate. 1, 5, 7 years, that's pretty good. 9 years, you're pressing it. Caiaphas, well longer than that. I think he's pressing into 15, 35, towards 2 decades. So he had to be pretty politically savvy. Nonetheless, the people, because they understood that the high priestly role was a lifetime responsibility, they very likely would have understood any of the other living high priests with that honor. So when the high priest is sometimes referred to in the plural here and then in the book of Acts, it's because there were. So Annas is still a central figure. Even after Caiaphas, at least 5 of his sons end up being high priest. So this is a big deal family. So Jesus before Annas is not any minor thing. And the palace where they lived, I would presume, share space. So Annas the high priest is probably within earshot of Caiaphas. Maybe they even share a courtyard. And so we have all this to say, when Jesus comes before Annas, and this whole conversation sounds a bit different than what's in the other Gospels, it may be because it's just a different conversation. It's either that or John is choosing to highlight something different. In the other cases, Jesus is pressed, as with Mark 14:61. He is pressed after not answering this question and that question and just remaining silent. He's finally asked, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" And there in verse 62, he says, "I am." Ego eimi. Over against Peter's, "Ou eimi." No. There we see Jesus, "Ego eimi, I am." But here in John's Gospel, there's a bit of a different emphasis. Again, maybe because this is a preliminary conversation between Jesus and Annas. But this is the conversation. This isn't some accident of history or John forgot the other details. This is what he chose to include. So why did he choose to include this conversation Jesus had with the former high priest? Well, we look at what they discuss. Annas asked him about 2 things, right? What are they? What are the 2 things? Because it's a little different here in this conversation. He's not asked straight-faced, "Who are you?" What has he asked? There are 2 things he's asked about, 2 general things. Do you see it? What's that? Okay. He's asked about his doctrine or his teaching. So this is all verse 19 if you're looking for the cheat code. Okay, verse 19, what else? And his disciples. And actually his disciples are asked about first. That seems to be the bigger thing looming on Annas' mind. Isn't it interesting then that when Jesus, who is always careful with choosing his words, and here and in the other gospel accounts, he is happy to be silent on many questions. Here, when he is asked about these 2 things, your disciples and his teaching, and the disciples seem to be the bigger thing in view. Interesting then that Jesus, who so often remains silent, he answers as to the doctrine, but he's quiet as to the disciples. And I think even with that, there is a contrast between him and Peter that is palpable. Consider, what did Peter's denials functionally do? They pushed Jesus away. They put Jesus at a difference that made Peter feel safe. Right? Consider the contrast. What did Jesus do? Jesus certainly could have benefited from some eyewitnesses here. But instead, Jesus kept his disciples at a safe distance. You see, Peter is trying to push Jesus away. Jesus is sort of doing the same thing by not answering about the disciples, but he does it with a different motive. He is not trying to preserve himself. He is trying to preserve them. He is asked about his disciples. Now, we don't know what's involved in that. Is Annas looking for someone who's a a convincing, prominent figure? Who's following you? Or is he looking for names? We know that a persecution does come upon the Christians after this. Is he looking for some names? Either way, Jesus doesn't give him that. He puts that distance that Peter put. But it's not, again, because he was trying to save himself, but he would save his disciples. Again, he would have benefited from some eyewitnesses. The witnesses that were called were junk witnesses, as the other accounts make clear. And here he had at least two nearby. He had at least two witnesses nearby. There's a lot of things that sort of cloud this whole trial. One of them is the way this thing proceeds isn't even legitimate. You're not even supposed to ask the accused questions. You're supposed to bring witnesses forward. This was the ancient structure. You bring witnesses forward for either side and you question them. Right? Because the accused is always going to say, I didn't do it. But what do the witnesses say? But here, there aren't witnesses called, at least not for Jesus. And the other accounts talk about witnesses that are called against him. The point is that clearly this proceeding is not going as it should, and the way Jesus is being questioned is wrong and illegitimate. But the other thing is, Jesus could have greatly benefited from a couple witnesses here, standing out here alone, guys, and yet he safely keeps them at a distance. He doesn't dialogue with the high priest about his disciples. He lovingly kept the heat on himself, even while Peter chose to warm himself. Instead of reaching out to his friends, he called the world as his witness. Said, I've spoken openly to the world. And that's exactly how he answered the other question related to his teaching. The contrast again is significant. Peter has now completely gone off grid in terms of his discipleship. He doesn't want anyone tracking him. He's turned his phone off. He's canceled the GPS. He's picked up a dumb phone on the side of the road. He's completely gone into hiding. And sometimes the best place to hide is in plain sight. So as it is, he looks like everyone else around that fire, or at least he's trying to. And yet there seems to be things that are giving him away. Maybe it's his Galilean accent. Certainly doesn't help that someone recognizes him. But for Jesus, when he is facing his accusers and his interrogation, Jesus states positively and negatively that he has always been an open book before the watching world. He says it in two ways, negative and positive. On the negative side, I'll take that first. Jesus said, I have said nothing in secret. This doesn't mean he didn't say anything to his disciples in private. What it means is he wasn't saying things in secret that controverted what he said in public. He wasn't putting on a public face, but then you get in there. It's like, ooh, there's weird stuff in there. No, he was saying the weird stuff out front. Remember what he said about eat my flesh, drink my blood, and how many people left him that day? And even the disciples were thinking about, will you guys leave me too? He put everything out there. Even though when his disciples were drawn close, he built upon what they received. The only aspect of his being secretive was connected to time. There was a time when he had to be kept secret until the fullness of revelation was to be made. John 7:4 uses the same word for secret, which sounds to us like cryptic. It's kryptos, or kryptos, the word behind secret here. And that word is used in John chapter 7 a few times, and so is the word that Jesus used for openly, which is a word for boldness or public. So for secret, in John 7:4, his own brothers, which seem to be his brothers by blood, sons of his mother, whom they shared, 7:4, for no one seeks, this is what they said to Jesus. There's a festival coming up. No one seeks to make a reputation for himself. No one who seeks to make a reputation for himself does anything in secret, kryptos. If you are doing these things, the type of things he's been doing, show yourself to the world. So there was a time for him to be, but as he revealed to his mother, it's not yet my time. When she said, would you get involved at the wedding of Cana? And then in 7:10, talks about after Jesus saying he wouldn't go up to the feast in a somewhat humorous way. It says in verse 10, but when his brothers had gone up to the feast, then Jesus himself also went up, not openly, but in secret. But again, this had a timestamp, because wouldn't you know it, at that festival, it says at the middle of the festival, what did Jesus do? He taught openly. In the middle of the festival, speaking over the massive crowd. Peak time in the middle of the week. Maybe some people couldn't make it early in the festival. But by the middle of the week, everyone should be there by then. Even if you had a sick aunt or something going on, you were probably there by the middle of the week. And it's at the middle of the week that Jesus comes out of the secret place and speaks openly. And so Jesus says, I have said nothing in secret. If it was just for a time. And now he states it positively. I have spoken openly to the world. And it's maybe an interesting dig here that he qualifies that the two places he says where he's been speaking, the synagogue and the temple. Interesting that he just associated those subtly with the world whom they were presently aligned. He said, I have spoke openly to the world. And what that has amounted to in his ministry, the synagogue and the temple. Places that are supposed to be holy places, they can be worldly places. Right? He had to go into that temple and flip the tables because of what they had become, what they were becoming. In that same chapter of John 7, in verse 13, this word for openly, or it sometimes is best translated as boldly, other times as publicly. John 7:13, everyone else, as Jesus starts to speak, and they're looking for Jesus to come to that same festival that he had first entered secretly. It says, however, no one spoke openly about him for fear of the Jewish leaders. This fear was a real thing. And then in verses 25 to 26, after Jesus does begin to speak and speaks openly and speaks just boldly with nothing holding him back, everyone's watching him. And this is what is said in verse 25 and 26, again of chapter 7. Then some of the residents of Jerusalem began to say, isn't this the man they are trying to kill? Yet here he is speaking publicly, openly, boldly. And they are saying nothing to him. Do the ruling authorities really know that this man is the Christ? What do we make of all this? Look at Peter. And then look at the Christ. Look at the self-preservation, which we are all vulnerable to doing, to acting upon. Look at Jesus' preservation of his disciples. He had prayed for them. When he was first approached by the guards, he was the one who stepped forward to make sure Peter wasn't the very first line of defense. He was the one who supervened that whole situation so that Peter didn't kill that man. He was the one who healed the man's ear. He was the man who said, if you seek me, let these men go. And now, When he's asked about his disciples, he is the one who stayed silent on that and instead brought the heat on himself. He said, I've spoken openly to the world. Why don't you ask? I imagine he must have looked around the room. Everybody's heard me. Why don't you ask them? Peter's heard. Mitch has heard. Aubrey's heard. Maggie's heard. Why don't you ask them? Everybody's in this courtyard. There's witnesses being called. Jesus says, I don't need to speak for myself. Everybody's heard me. Everybody knows where I stand. Ask them. It's an amazing picture of boldness. And again, one thing that this whole scene does for us, beyond inviting us into just worship of how great our Lord and Savior is, one thing it does for us that we are supposed to, sort of a moral to the story, is this invitation to a readiness to stand for Christ. An invitation to follow the example of Christ rather than the example of Peter. But again, no matter how good our example is going to be in this earth, and we ought to seek with every fiber of our being to give the best example of Christ we can be. We should make no excuses, no justifications for ourselves. But as great an example as any of us will be, we will always be pointing to Jesus as the perfect example, as the one who never failed, as the one who never denied, as the one who had no daylight between his prayer life, between his words, between his deeds, between his heart. There was no daylight there. And all of us, no matter how good we get, until Christ's return, when he perfects us, when we are perfected, when we see his face. Until then, there's going to be some level of daylight there. And we should, again, I said this last time, we should be praying that the Lord close that gap. But we should always be reminding one another, we are not the heroes. We have been given the light, and we have been given the light to share with the dark world. We have. But Jesus is the light of the world. The light we have is from him. And so we always point people back to him. I mentioned earlier being outed by that pastor. Maybe I'll get the chance to out some of you out in public along for the day. There are probably as many times as we might be outed as Christians when we're not ready for it. There are probably many, many more situations. There are, in which we recognize that we have the light that someone in darkness needs, and that maybe we recognize we also have some daylight with which to operate. The invitation of this text is to make the best use of the time, to make the best of every opportunity. To as John the Baptist did, to confess and not to deny, but to confess. I'm not the Christ, but yes, I know the Christ. And the Christ, he is the light. He is the light of the world. The darkness has not overcome him, and I know him, and you ought to know him. May that be our confession. May that be our proclamation. May that be our joy, our blessing. Even if that earns us a slap. Jesus took a slap across the face for his boldness, and then he took much worse. This is just the birth pangs of his suffering. What would we be willing to take for a little bit more boldness? What if it got us a slap? Very likely a social slap, right? Maybe a slap at work in some way. Are we willing to go there to profess Christ? I'll close with the words of another commentator, and then I'll read of the blessedness that exists for those who are bold in Revelation 3. One commentator just summed up this whole thing very nicely, much more quickly than I did, but you have the time, you're here, you made the effort, so I'm taking the time you've given me. In the face of their accusers, Jesus denied nothing, whereas Peter denied everything. You see, because for us to deny Christ, that's everything. Because for us, Jesus has become everything. He is our hope. He is our love. He is our life. He is our truth, the way, truth, and the life. He is our good shepherd. He is the door. He is the resurrection. He's it. So may we never deny him. May we never deny him. And as he gives us opportunities, maybe we will never. In fact, I hope for you and for me, I hope we never have to suffer the duress of the first century church. It became so tempting to deny Christ just with your mouth. I hope we never are in such a situation that we are tempted as they were to deny Christ. Even so, even if we never face that day, I know for me, and then a representative of the church, I want us to give a bold witness for Christ. I don't want to be a closet Christian. I don't want this church to be a closet church. Some might prefer to live a life in secret, of secret discipleship. We hear of secret disciples in John's gospel, but there is a blessing for those who come out. And that coming out, often, it starts with being baptized in Jesus' name. Baptism, when they're done publicly, it's essentially a coming out party. It's telling the world who you are. I'm with Jesus. I'm with Jesus. I'm not ashamed of it. Romans 1:16, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of salvation. When someone gets baptized, that's what they're doing. I'm with Jesus, planting the flag publicly. I'm coming out. And we have one coming. Pray for those who are coming out as Christians, and pray for those who need to. Keep praying. There are people regularly in our midst who come to church who have not yet come out. They've not yet followed Christ. Some people online, they're listening and they're following along and they're believing this, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, but they need to come out for Christ. They need to follow him in the waters of baptism. They need to live for him, to love him, not to intellectually accept him. The two great commandments are to love God and love others. Not to have intellectual assent, but to love. And so pray for those who need to take that step. I want to close with Revelation 3, chapter 7. You talk about blessings on those who persevere, blessings on those who do not deny. There are a few of these blessings given to different churches. There's one in chapter 2 for a different church that wouldn't deny Christ when the pressure was on them. But I just think the description given in Revelation 3 from verse 7 to the church in Philadelphia, the name that represents brotherly love, is so fitting. So let me close with these words. And to the angel of the church in Philadelphia write, the words of the Holy One, the true one, who has the key of David, who opens and no one will shut, who shuts and no one opens. I know your works. Behold, I have set before you an open door, which no one is able to shut. I know that you have but little power, and yet you have kept my word and have not denied my name. Behold, I will make those of the synagogue of Satan, who say that they are Jews and are not, but lie. Behold, I will make them come and bow down before your feet, and they will learn that I have loved you. Because you have kept my word about patient endurance, I will keep you from the hour of trial that is coming on the whole world to try those who dwell on the earth. I am coming soon. Hold fast what you have, so that no one may seize your crown. The one who conquers, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. Never shall he go out of it, and I will write on him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the new Jerusalem, which comes down from God out of heaven, and my own new name. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Amen.